The archaeologists puzzled over the function of these huge columns. They could not hold up a roof. The heights are different. They now believe these columns are an ancient ritual platform where the dead were exposed to vultures and the bones eaten clean. As the birds of the air ate away the flesh, the spirit could be set free. Here, for the first time, religion became a huge public drama. Its rituals were played out in the open air at a special sanctuary.
There seems to be no settlement. This must be some kind of central ritual place for a number of surrounding communities. And that suggests that communities really are networking, that whatever they're doing in their own community, they're coming together with people from all sorts of other communities to use one central site which they share.
The journey from first farming to a shared religion took 1,000 years. Now, it was time to move on.
Once you've got the whole package, then population's beginning to take a real kick upwards. And then you need more territory. So you're beginning to get groups colonizing new land. Maybe they're having to modify the way they live in order to colonize as they go, but colonizing new land. So you begin to get the spread of agricultural colonists.
Between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, colonizing farmers spread out from the Middle East through Turkey and into southern Europe. The journeys were pioneered by traders who made sea voyages in small boats. Now the farmers set out with some seeds, a few animals, and the idea of farming. They found a vast continent. They faced the challenge of a new landscape and a new climate. The forest was impenetrable, so they moved up the major rivers.
They're coming in very small numbers into a continent that is already inhabited. So there are lots of people already living there, and it's not as if there was a great frontier of movement and all the natives are being cleared out of the way. These first farmers are really inserting themselves around the much more powerful established communities who are already present. And these Mesolithic natives, the hunters and gatherers whose ancestors had been living there since the Ice Age, were probably there in much greater numbers.
The hunter-gatherers living here never found grains which could be farmed, or the right herd animals to domesticate. The shift to farming just hadn't been possible.
One of the traps we have to avoid, I think, is that we shouldn't think that people back in those times were dumber, not so bright, not so intelligent. So far as we know, they had brains exactly like ours. And if they survived in the conditions in which they lived, they were probably a lot smarter on their feet than most of us are today.
Clan by clan across southern Europe, the native hunter-gatherers were confronted by change. By 7,000 years ago, the travellers were in contact with fishing people at Lepenski Vir in Slovakia. Here, archaeologists can see how the hunter-gatherers and farmers confronted the challenge. They would meet together to trade. The hunter-gatherers offered horn and furs. The farmers brought the necessary animals and seeds to allow the Europeans to develop. They carried the idea of farming.
Good job. Right up.
Two ways of life were coming together, transferring knowledge and forming bonds. The explorers pressed on to find good farming land nearby. The families became neighbours. The hunter-gatherers would soon become farmers.
When we say farming, let's be very clear what is moving into Europe at this time, because the image of farmers is one that has many contemporary resonances which are really quite irrelevant. These are simple peasants who are using only a basic range of crops. They were settling in small patches of land that were appropriate for growing the crops that they brought with them, and they were constantly adapting to this new environment. But they were also changing it because they were moving into a forested environment, and forests don't allow crops to grow.
To the early farmers, the forest must have been a fearful place. It was easy to get lost. There were bears and wolves. Perhaps the forest had its own spirits. Now the farmers did something that would change the face of Europe forever. They began to systematically clear the forest. They needed to let in the sun.
They start off in Southeast Europe with small axes of the kind that they'd used in the Near East, and as they move into the great forests of Central Europe, you see the technology getting larger so that they can tackle these very large standing forests.
The techniques depended on the forest. Some places could be burnt, but large amounts went down with nothing more than stone axes.
I think you have to think of scattered patches of human occupation, often quite distant one from another, but forming a chain of connections all the way across the continent. So it's not as if a swathe has been cut and clear felled from coast to coast. It's very much more that individual groups of people have set up their homes in the woodlands and are gradually expanding around these original homesteads.
As these pioneers built their own way of life in Europe, they lost touch with the Middle East. Behind them, in the Fertile Crescent, the old way of life was in crisis. Over 2,000 years, villages had slowly changed the land.
Before villages got established, there was very little human impact on the environment at all. People were moving around. They didn't stay in one place for very long. They didn't have the opportunity to impact the environment. But now, as people are settled in one place, the impacts they do have can build on each other. And they can continue to affect the environment generation after generation after generation.
At Ain Ghazal, Roelofsen found evidence of the crisis in the wooden posts that held up their roofs.
The posts that started out at up to 60 centimeters in diameter decrease gradually in size. And we think this reflects the absolute decrease in large trees that are in close proximity to Ain Ghazal itself.
Then the plaster began to suffer, even though they loved it.